Hey guys, welcome back to a brand new video. And in today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2022 United States Senate elections according to the polls. What that means is I'll be taking the polling average on 538 of every single Senate race, be filling it out for whichever party is currently ahead in each and every one of these states. So, with that out of the way, let's just get right into it. Should be a pretty self-explanatory video here. So, there are some states that don't really have polls, or maybe they have one poll, but it doesn't really matter because they're safe anyways. So, for the Democrats, those states are Oregon, California, Hawaii, um, Maryland, Vermont, and Connecticut. For the Republicans, those states are Idaho, the Dakotas, Oklahoma. No, I think we do have one Oklahoma poll. Um, we have Arkansas, not Missouri. They've had some polls in Missouri. Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, South Carolina, and Indiana. So yeah, that's it. These are the states that are safe and maybe only have one poll, and the rest we have some amount of polling data to look at that's at least semi-interesting. Then Alaska is the last addition to the Republican column because again, Alaska is a state where we've now officially eliminated all the candidates except for Lisa Murkowski and Kelly Tshibaka, meaning that it will be a Tshibaka versus Murkowski race in November, and both of those candidates are Republicans. So uh, I think Murkowski is favored right now, but either way, it's going to be a Republican victory. So let's start by taking a look at the state of Washington. We'll be doing this in geographical order here. In Washington, as we can see right here, is a state where we saw some type polls 9, 11, 5, but since then it's gotten a lot more democratic. And again, when you add all these polls up, I'm just doing it in my head quickly here. That's 63 divided by 5. That comes out to a 12 point something percent margin of victory for the Democrats, which isn't the likely column, but again, the very high end of it. So Washington likely Democratic. Um, Now, before we go on to Nevada and Arizona, I do actually want to mention these other polls here just briefly. Where, as you can see, we got some new polls today. They haven't been added to 538, but I do want to briefly mention them here before we get into Arizona and Wisconsin Senate. First of all, we saw a poll out of Arizona where Mark Kelly has a 8 point lead over Blake Masters, and then again, the margin of error is 3%. So not only is Mark Kelly polling already at majority support, but he's also way outside the margin of error. And so that's a really good poll for him. Then in Wisconsin, interestingly enough, we do see Ron Johnson trailing Mandela Barnes, although again, caution for Wisconsin polls. Wisconsin polls always come with a big asterisk, and that is that in 2020, they overestimated the Democrats by about 6% on average. So again, this is it's a good sign for Mandela Barnes that he has a lead over Ron Johnson, but again, we have to remember that Mandela Barnes, 4 point lead for him, probably won't be enough to get him the victory, especially in an environment like this. So let's just not forget that. Now back to the state of Nevada. Let's talk about Nevada. Nevada right now, Catherine Cortez Masto holds a lead of about 1.5%. That's in the tilt column. So again, polls right now showing a very, very slim Democratic victory there. Now in Arizona, it's kind of the opposite story where we are seeing a very, very strong showing from the Democratic Party. And so I don't know if they've added in the poll yet. They haven't yet, but it basically seems the same because Kelly's up by 8. Maybe it would go down by a little bit. But right now, Kelly's up by 10% in the aggregate. That is a very good showing for him. And it's similar to the state of Washington, which is a lot more Democratic than Arizona. So the fact that Arizona is Kelly plus 10, way outside the margin of error in a state where the polls have been decently good in the past 6, 8 years, that's a pretty good sign for Mark Kelly. And I really do think that Mark Kelly is going to, at least as of today, I think he's favored to win re-election. So Mark Kelly being up 10 in the polls is very good for him. And if you take the polls at face value, he'd be winning by 10% right now. Now, Utah's up next. Utah's interesting because we have an independent candidate, Evan McMullen, running against a Republican incumbent, Mike Lee. McMullen's probably going to get all the Democratic votes as well as some moderate Republicans, but he's still going to lose. And in the polls, he's down by 9%, although we do have some recent polling that showed the race tightening. But again, we do need to see more polls before we actually consider this race competitive between Lee and McMullen. And, polls right now show it as likely Republican, which is still a good showing for Mike Lee. Colorado, we actually had a Republican poll do Colorado, and it was McLaughlin Associates. McLaughlin is a very, very Republican poll, very, very Republican leaning. And again, they're kind of a poll where Republicans are just always going to have leads, always going to do well, and they still have Michael Bennet down to Joe O'Dea. And so that's the second of two polls that we have seen with this matchup, Bennet O'Dea, the other being Bennet plus 13 and a more Democratic leaning pollster. That averages out to about a lead of 10.5% for the Democrats. Michael Bennet right now seems on track to, according to the polls, on track to win by about the same amount as Mark Kelly. So that's very interesting, but make of that what you will. Kansas, we only have one poll in Kansas in the Senate race. I just thought I'd mention it briefly. And it has Jerry Moran beating Holland, who I think is the mayor of some city. I don't know. But Moran's beating him by 21%, which actually isn't that good for Moran. Like, he's going to win no matter what, but in 2016, he won by, like, a lot more, and he outran Trump by, like, 15 or 20 points. So I just thought I'd briefly mention that, just so you guys were aware that he's only up by 20 points in that one poll. Oklahoma is interesting, too. We do have a couple of polls there. Again, this is from 20... they haven't added it yet, but there was one Senate internal that I think had it within 25, but again, doesn't really matter. Missouri is up next. Missouri, we have a few Schmidt versus Trudy Bush Valentine polling data. As you can see right here, the most recent poll out of if I can find it first, most recent polls out of Missouri showing Trudy Bush Valentine trailing Eric Schmidt by about 6%. So kind of close, but again, this ton of undecideds here. Then if we go down for some more polling between Schmidt and Bush Valentine, down 13, and then down 18. So yeah, not too good for Trudy Bush Valentine that she's down 6, 13, and 18. That again is gonna get you to about just like 12.5, 13%. I'm just doing quick math here. It's not gonna be accurate, but what matters more is the margin, and so that's a likely margin for Missouri. Although again, if it were Eric Greitens, it probably would have been in the lean or even tilt category according to the polls, because the polls in Missouri, first of all, tend to always overestimate the Republican Party's support. They also always seem to be very, very low on people like Eric Greitens, again, who have a ton of undecideds who need to come home for him, and usually they do, but in the polls in Missouri with Greitens, they showed pretty close races. You can see he was tied with Trudy Bush Valentine, with there being a ton of undecideds. Iowa's up next. Iowa's interesting because it's supposed to be a safe race, but the polls have it pretty close, and Signal, first of all, is a Republican poll. They have it only an 8-point race between Grassley and Franken. And then Sells, which is arguably the best pollster in the country, they really only do Iowa, but usually what they say in Iowa is what happens. And they only have Grassley up by 8. So again, you average out all these polls and you get, a high double-digit lead for Grassley, which would be the worst performance of his career electorally, because he's always won. Like in 2016, his last time he won by like 25 or 30 points, and I don't think he lost a county. So again, always important to remember that Chuck Grassley, he'll win this year, but it could be a little closer than it's been in the past. Illinois is up next. We only have one poll out of Illinois, and it shows Tammy Duckworth beating Kathy Salvi by 9%. I think it'll be by a bit more than that, her ultimate margin of victory. But yeah, that's what the one poll is showing. Again, I'm not doing this for narratives. We're just going to talk about what the polls are showing, not my personal predictions again. Now, Wisconsin's interesting, because in Wisconsin, we've gotten some recent polling data between Mandela Barnes and Ron Johnson, which is going to be the matchup here. And so what we're seeing is that the first poll we got from Marquette in June had Barnes up by 2% with a ton of undecideds. He was nowhere near 50. But this poll had him beating Johnson by 7. And that's interesting. Again, the polls in Wisconsin in 2020 were about 5.5%, 6% off towards Joe Biden. They overestimated him by a lot, and he actually almost lost the state despite the fact he was up 6 in the polling averages. And so, again, I want to caution when you look at these polls with Barnes and Johnson. And again, in 2016, Johnson was down the polls. He won re-election. So Wisconsin and Ron Johnson polls just do not get along well. And I think Ron Johnson still in real life is the favorite. But again, when you take a look solely at the polls, he's down 4.5% on average. So that is in the lean category. Again, Mandela Barnes seems to be beating Ron Johnson as of right now in the polls. In Kentucky, I don't think we have any polling there, but I'm just going to check to make sure, because I think Booker might have released one internal. But yeah, this is interesting. Mason Dixon polled it back in January. They showed a 16% lead for Rand Paul, so just outside the margin of likely and safe. So that's likely, or that's safe Republican. It's only one poll though. It's from a while ago, so it doesn't really mean too much. But Kentucky's going to go red no matter what. Ohio is really interesting because when you take a look at the polls here, Ryan was ahead by 4.5% until pretty recently. It's now down to 1% lead, because the thing is, we got a good poll. Emerson's usually pretty good at polling Ohio. Again, Ohio's hard to poll, but Emerson is like all right in comparison to the other polls. We're seeing here is that Vance has now surged. He went from down in all these internal polls and these more biased or anti-GOP pollsters, and Vance is now leading by 3, and that's closed the gap. And Ryan's only up by a point now, and it seems like Vance is just going to take the lead eventually. So again, Tim Ryan's running a good campaign, but it looks like he's going to ultimately end up losing here. It's kind of like, I guess it's like the best comparison I can think of is baseball season. When your team's an underdog, they're not expected to do very well. Maybe they start out really hot, have a stretch of games they get lucky, but again, the gap eventually closes. Your luck eventually catches up to you, and that seems to be what's happening with Tim Ryan here and JD Vance right now. catching up to him. He's still ahead, and Ryan still has like a chance to win, but it's getting closer and closer by the day. Florida, we've got a lot of weird polls there. Polling in Florida is just broken, and so generally have to rely on other things. But if we take a look at Florida, what we're seeing here is polls from all over the place. So some polls show it really close. Other polls show Rubio up by 11, 10%. This poll shows Val Demings ahead. This is University of North Florida, so that's interesting. But yeah, so again, it's going to be interesting to see what the margin is. Like Rubio's like a 95% chance of winning, but I'll be more interested to see what the margin is. But anyways, this kind of all averages out to 5-6% margin of victory for the GOP, which is just a likely category. It could be lean actually. I'll just put it in likely just to be safe here. Anyways, moving over to the state of Georgia. Georgia's going to be interesting because the polls have actually been pretty accurate in the past. Like in 2020, they showed Biden up by a point. He won by a little less than that. And right now they're showing Warnock ahead by just under 2%. So again, the gap's closing a little bit, but we've gotten some interesting polling. We saw a poll from Andover, Phillips Academy Andover, and I think they're the only high school poll in the country that's actually really interesting. But what I will say is that they had a lot of undecideds, and I think they oversampled white voters by 9% in their poll. So again, this Walker plus 2 poll could have easily been Warnock plus 1 or 2 had they sampled white voters at a bit of a lower and more representative of the 2020 electorate manner. And then these other polls we're seeing are Warnock leads, and this one poll has a Walker lead, but again, the more you scroll down, the more Warnock leads you see, and he's still ahead by 2% in the average. In Georgia's, the polls are usually all right, so I think Warnock is favored now, even when you take out the polls. North Carolina is really interesting, though, because North Carolina, for the first time, the Democrats have the lead here. As you can see, Sherry Beasley beating Ted Budd by just 0.1%. It's going to be very close, I think, both in general election and in the polls right now. But polls are showing a Democratic lead in North Carolina. And then also, when you take a look at the most recent poll, it's really interesting because Signal, which again is a Republican internal poll, they're usually all right. Like their polls aren't awful, but this is a Republican poll. They show a dead heat between Sherry Beasley and Ted Budd. And, 2 months ago, they had Budd up by 5. So they're showing narrowing there. And these other polls, Blueprint had Beasley up by 4. This John Bolton Super PAC, which is a Republican, had Beasley up by 2%. So I find this all very interesting that Beasley's closing the gap and seems to be gaining momentum in North Carolina. But again, North Carolina's a swing state, and maybe it'll surprise us. I still think the Republicans are going to win it. But again, the poll's telling a different story right now. Now, Pennsylvania, this one's really interesting because, again, Pennsylvania, the polls just show a blowout for the Democrats. John Fetterman up by 11.5%. That is very much in the likely column. And also this recent poll from Public Opinion Strategies with a Pittsburgh Works Together sponsor. I don't really know what that is, but it's based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, it looks like. Fetterman up by 18%. That's just massive. Fetterman seems to just have this massive lead over Dr. Oz. He's nearing 50%. So Dr. Oz probably hitting the panic button right now with being down that much. Again, things can still change. There's a lot of reasons to think the gap is going to close, but Oz has been down in the polls since June, and he hasn't really shown any signs of recovering. Like, if anything, it's actually gotten worse for him because, again, originally Fetterman was up by 4.5%, and then starting at the end of July, just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and Fetterman just keeps expanding his lead. So that's really interesting that Fetterman's up by that much, but hey, that's where we are in the polls right now. New York is up next. New York right now, we only have one poll. I believe it's a Republican poll, so it'll probably be a little more tilted towards the GOP. But Chuck Schumer in this poll was up by about 15%. Yeah, this is the poll I was talking about. John Jordan, Dick Morris. This is a McLaughlin poll. Then we saw some other polls back from July that are more accurate pollsters. Emerson, Siena are both decent pollsters, and they showed Schumer up in the 20s. So that's a safe margin of victory, although it will, kind of similar to Grassley, be down from 2016. Now, finally, New Hampshire is our final state. See where we stand in New Hampshire. And again, we don't know who's going to win the GOP nomination here between Chuck Morse and Don Bolduc. I think Bolduc is favored in the most recent GOP poll. He was up by 16%, although, again, primaries are really hard to predict. You never want to make assumptions when it's in doubt. So, all the polls we've seen here have shown Hassan up by similar amounts. Morse led in this one poll, which is interesting, but Hassan's been up all these other polls. And I think they're going to, combine for probably a 4 or 5% margin of victory for the Democrats. I think it's likely. I do think when you add them all up, which I'm not going to do right now because I can't do it all in my head that quickly. But it's probably going to get you out to a 5, 6, 7 point lead for Maggie Hassan. Either way, she's definitely ahead. She was up in like all but 1 or 2 polls. So, anyways, this is the Senate map according to polls right now. Again, as you can see, Democrats sweeping all the swing states with the exception of Florida, but Florida's not really a swing state this year. And so as you can see, Cortez Masto holds on in Nevada. Kelly holds on in Arizona. Warnock holds on in Georgia. Hassan holds on in New Hampshire. Democrats flip seats. Fetterman beats Oz in Pennsylvania. Tim Ryan beats J.D. Vance in Ohio. Mandela Barnes beating out Ron Johnson in Wisconsin. Then in the state of Florida, gap a little close between Rubio and Demings. In Missouri, Trudy Bush Valentine does a little better than expected against Eric Schmidt. Chuck Grassley probably loses a county this time around, and it's a little closer than in Utah. Evan McMullen's more competitive than we're expecting. So again, the poll is showing a very, very good sentiment for the Democrats right now. This would be an incredible showing for them. They'd be doing very well if this was the result. But again, I have my doubts, and I really don't think this is going to be the result. I think Democrats are going to lose a lot more of these races than the polls are suggesting. But again, we'll have to wait. We'll have to wait and see till Election Day. And anyone who tells you they know what's going to happen this election is lying, because it's just so unpredictable. We have to keep looking at the data. So send them up according to the polls right now. Not my prediction. I know someone's going to ask me if this is my prediction. It's not my prediction. It's just where the polls are as of today. So thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye, guys.